From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Anne-Marie Hordern, I'm Joe Matthew.
The Fed holds the line, keeping rates unchanged at a 22-year high. Chair Powell saying they're exercising caution due to the current environment.
Given how far we have come, along with the uncertainties and risks we face, the committee is proceeding carefully.
This as House Speaker Mike Johnson works to shore up support for the GOP Israel aid bill, which faces an uphill battle if he can move it past the House.
We'll speak with Republican Senators Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia and Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University on the U.S.'s options in the Middle East. But first, Joe, another issue for the Speaker.
Yeah.
A brand new one, and this is the CBO score for his plan of this standalone Israel bill. He wanted to offset it with rescinding some of this money to the IRS, but the CBO says actually it's going to cost more money. It
would add to the deficit. Some critics of this plan suggested as much yesterday when this was really first discussed in Washington, Anne-Marie, but we actually got numbers on it today from the CBO. And the new speaker, as you would expect, was asked about it. Speaker Johnson reacting to the scoring, as they call it, on this bill earlier today.
Were you surprised by the CBO score, sir?
Not surprised at all. Only in Washington, when you cut spending, do they call it a...
Are you alarmed by the CBO score?
Oh, questions he didn't want to answer. Joining us now around the table to answer some of them, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Michael McKee. Thank you both for joining us. Really also an important day, given what the Fed's going on, and also when you look at some of these numbers behind the standalone bill, Megan. Will he have the votes then, given this CBO score?
To get it through the House. He may. He's to hold together this very fragile and narrow majority that he has, which we have seen can splinter at a moment's notice and often in unpredictable ways. The real issue for him, though, is getting it through the Senate. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said it is dead on arrival due to these IRS cuts that he has proposed, which we're now seeing from the CBO, which is important to stress that the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is a nonpartisan organization that will actually cost money in the long run. And then you have the veto threat that President Biden has also waged on this bill.
That's really important to add, and the White House has made that clear should it reach his desk, but nobody thinks it will, Anne-Marie. We just know where the White House is here. So how much of this, and I think I know your answer, is politics versus math? You just heard from the Speaker. He seems to think this cuts spending somehow, but this doesn't tell a very good story when it comes to deficits.
Sure. So this money, let's go back a little bit. This additional money for the IRS was pushed by Democrats last year to increase IRS operations, investigations, essentially to allow them to claw back money that people have not claimed. And Republicans have long said this weaponizes the IRS, and this is going to target middle-class Americans who file their tax returns. And what Democrats have said all along is, no, this is actually intended to save money by ensuring that everything is claimed and tying everything up in a neat bow, in allowing the IRS to basically enforce itself. The CBO estimate is essentially math, as you said, and not politics, but it does help augment the Democrats' arguments.
But what's better politics than, bad-mouthing the IRS? It's an easy target. I don't know if you saw this, Anne-Marie. The IRS commissioner, Daniel Werfel, says the offsets would end up, in fact, costing $90 billion due to less scrutiny on tax evasion of the wealthiest Americans.
Right, because the IRS is supposed to be revenue generating.
That's the idea.
And to your point yesterday, Joe, you think about the IRS, the fact is it is very backwards. They don't have the latest technology, and that's what a lot of this money would be used for. Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma discussed Speaker Johnson's bill with us yesterday on Balance of Power.
Speaker Johnson has to get it past the House, and I support whatever he tries to do. I'd rather see the two combined. We're only as good as our word, and America said we're going to be there for Israel. America said we're going to be there for Ukraine, and therefore we need to be there for them both. However, if Speaker Johnson can only get Israel package done and he needs to go at Ukraine differently, then, you know, whatever he can get done, that's his chamber. He's got to have the runway to do what he can.
Megan, the next question is, even if he can pass standalone Israel bill, you could see right there, even from Mark Wayne Mullen, someone who has a good relationship with Speaker Johnson, the Senate wants to see more. They want to see Ukraine aid. So what becomes of this bill?
They want to see Ukraine aid. They want to see Taiwan aid. There's a lot that they want piled in this, and they do not want these IRS cuts, or at least Senate Democrats do not. And you need 60 votes to get anything through the Senate. So you're not even just talking about the Senate majority, the Democrats over there, but there are several hawkish Republicans, including Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, who really support this Ukraine aid. He's, in fact, one of the most fervent supporters of this Ukraine aid in all of Washington. So I don't see this getting anywhere in the Senate.
Interesting. We heard he met with Republican senators today, that the new speaker did. Lindsey Graham said he's the man for the moment coming out, and that's the biggest Ukraine hawk, I think, that you're going to find in the Senate, which is interesting. We'll see what comes of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because potentially also he's augmenting his tone depending on the audience. So he's doing a town hall this evening with Sean Hannity. It'll be interesting what he says there when a bunch of members are in the audience from centrists and also towards more the hard right.
The other big story we're balancing today, of course, brings us back to the economy, and that's the Federal Reserve. Yep. We had special coverage just a couple of hours ago, heard from the Fed chair, Jay Powell, speaking to reporters earlier today. Here he is.
Global geopolitical tensions are certainly elevated. And that goes for the war in Ukraine. It goes for the war between Israel and Hamas. We're monitoring that. Our job is to monitor those things for their economic implications. Another one is the possibility of government shutdown. We don't know about that one. So there's plenty of risk out there.
Geopolitics, shutdown politics. Michael McKee, it's great to have you at the table. Of course, Fed Day means that Michael McKee is in town. The headline on the terminal says it all. Yield rise reduces need to hike, but the door is still open. How uncertain are things now? You started to probe the Fed chair on the dot plot. You didn't get much of an answer today.
Well, they're very uncertain because the Fed had sort of relied on the market's understanding where they're going. And now they're a little bit unmoored. Basically, Powell left them with the message that the Fed doesn't know, meeting to meeting, what it's going to do. It thinks it's done. It could raise rates again. It's probably done, but maybe it needs to raise rates again. And so there's going to be this uncertainty that goes through everything that they do and every data point that comes in, because nobody's going to be able to say, well, the Fed is going to do this or that going forward. It's kind of hard to plan.
Well, Joe mentioned your question, and Jay Powell did seem quite uncertain.
He's still working on it.
Yeah, he's still working on an answer and seemed quite uncertain when our very own Michael McKee probed him. Take a listen.
I don't know that I want to just accept anybody's characterization of it. I'll tell you how we're doing this. So we're going meeting by meeting. We're asking ourselves whether we've achieved a stance of policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. That's the question we're asking. We're looking at the full range of economic data.
So every meeting is a live meeting.
Every meeting's a live meeting. They had, of course, in the dot plot suggested one more move before the end of the year, and that's it's not a forecast. We've gone through that many times, but that's the way Wall Street takes it and is looking at it. And now, forget the end of the year. It could be one more move. It could be more moves if they need to raise rates more. There's really no way to put it into any kind of specific formula at this point.
So what are you watching? What's the next data point or the next stop on the road that's going to make a difference?
Well, of course, we're all going to be up at 8:30 Friday morning Eastern time for the jobs report, and we'll be watching that. Then we get another CPI report coming up around the 14th of the month, and then at the end of the month, the PCE inflation numbers. So there'll be a number of the data points the Fed is looking at. But remember, we've had strong job growth. We've had rising inflation a little bit. Wages are rising. Spending is very strong. And yet the Fed paused. So do the data points really tell you anything about what the Fed is going to do? It's the question I asked him that kind of threw him. I said, have you moved now to just subjective decision making on the day of the meeting instead of having some kind of data point objectivity about what you're looking for?
And it sounds like they did.
Sounds like you got close to the truth there, yeah.
It's great that we have both of you here because actually these two stories are very much so connected. House Republicans are concerned about rising deficit. And when you look at the CBO, they say projected that interest would cost more than $10 trillion, Mike, over the next decade and exceed the defense budget by 2027. And with these supplementals, it's aid to national security partners.
Well, it's going to be a problem. We don't know when it exactly is going to be a problem. If we keep growing at 4.9% as we did last quarter, it wouldn't be a problem, which we're not going to do. So there is a problem out there.
At some point, of our budget will be paying our interest.
Part of the problem, and this is always the Washington story, is that it's always at some point. And something comes along and changes the dynamic. Social Security has almost gone bankrupt a number of times, and then it doesn't. So there's not always a lot of pressure on Congress to do something. Yeah. I don't think Congress is going to solve the problem of the deficit. I mean, it may stop adding as much to it, but we're not going to see interest rates at 5.25%, 5.5% for the 10 years that you're talking about, Emery. They will come down, not as far as they would have in the past, but they will come down, and that'll ease some of the burden.
Great to have you in Washington. Michael McKee and Bloomberg's Megyn Scully getting us rolling here. Coming up, we're going to take this conversation and bring it to the upper chamber. In the battle over aid to Israel and Ukraine, West Virginia Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito will be with us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Support in the Senate for aid for Israel and Ukraine is strong on a bipartisan level. So Speaker Johnson is facing an uphill battle if his bill gets through the House. That's a standalone Israel funding bill. And that's where we begin our conversation with West Virginia Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito. Senator, it's good to see you. I know you heard this week from the Secretaries of Defense and State in making their case to do this in one bundle, support Israel, Ukraine, and the other matters that include the border and Taiwan. I know you met today with the new Speaker of the House. He stopped by the GOP luncheon in the Senate, and it appears a lot of you were impressed despite your differences on this. Lindsey Graham, maybe the biggest hawk in the Senate when it comes to Ukraine, said he's the right guy at the right time, and I want to help him. What did he say to you?
Well, I think, first of all, for a lot of us, and me in particular, it was an introduction. I had never met the speaker, just seen what he was saying publicly. And so to have that more personal interaction is absolutely critical. I actually was served in the House for 14 years before he got there, so I know what the House is all about. And you can see, I could see why Speaker Johnson was elected. He's very articulate. He's well liked. He has a self-deprecating way about himself. He bowed to this fact that, not literally, but, oh, I'm up here at the upper chamber. That's, the little joke we always have between the two of us. But he did lay out concrete ideas and why he's moving in a direction, and that they're well thought out plans. And I think that's what we need to talk to with our leadership. Certainly I'm in leadership, to talk with him and his leadership team to see how we can work together on a lot of these issues.
Well, we want to show our audience as well what another member of your leadership team, of course, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, has to say about this. He talked about the threat of not funding Ukraine and Israel on the Senate floor yesterday. Take a listen.
The threats facing America and our allies are serious, and they're intertwined. If we ignore that fact, we do so at our own peril. The Biden administration's defense budget requests have systematically ignored these growing threats. The president's supplemental request to address multiple crises that have unfolded on his watch is a recognition of this failure.
He's saying it's a Biden recognition of failure, but at the same time, we do know he wants to fund all of these national security concerns around the world, including Ukraine. Do you think a Speaker Johnson is going to be able to see eye to eye with Senate Minority Leader McConnell?
Well, I think what Speaker Johnson needs to do, and this is what he said in our lunch, is, he needs to notch a win and the trust of his membership over there. And by putting forward an Israel-only package with an offset, arguably it's it's an offset that's been debated, that he's demonstrating that he's interested in spending less money, but also supporting Israel. So this is his first leadership commitment. And so I think to follow through on that, I think is important for him. When it comes to the Senate, many of us are committed to having Ukrainian continue this, to push back Putin and keep him, get him weaker and weaker. And these are all intertwined. And I believe that to be the case as well. So we may end up, once it comes over here, augmenting the package with those important issues. But it has to have serious policy objectives in there for the border, because this is about our own national security just as much as some of these other things, if not more. And so I think you'll look to see it be changed when it comes over here. But I think it's important for the Speaker to pass this. And you know what? Personally, I could vote for an Israel-only bill, but I do believe that we need to support Ukraine and also beef up our defenses on in the Indo-Pacific, but also, most importantly, the border.
I know you've got Secretaries Mayorkas and Becerra before the Appropriations Committee next week. Yeah. You're going to be talking a lot more about the border, and you've made clear, Senator, it's not just about money. I think you're just suggesting now it's about policy change. What do you need to see?
Well, I think we need to see substantive changes that's going to bend the numbers. I can't for the life of me see how this administration could keep sustaining policies that are letting over 200,000 people into our country. We don't know who they are. They've caught over 200 that are on the terror watch list, millions of people over the year, with no tangible results of anything that they say they're going to do. I don't think they care to do it. So we're going to force this on the president, and it's going to be asylum claims adjudication, it's going to be parole, it's going to be probably some remain in Mexico and other ways to stop the flow and deter people from coming into what we now see as an open border.
Well, do you think that will get Democrat votes? It's the only way it can pass the Senate.
I think it has to be, yes, I do think that it depends on, how far it goes and how far reaching. I think we have consensus on certain, there's a group working towards consensus on certain items in this space. I don't know how the Democrats honestly defend these numbers in our southern border in the time of all the fentanyl that's coming over, all the Secretary Mayorkas said yesterday, 600,000 gotaways. In other words, nobody knows who they are or where they are. So, I mean, these are indefensible positions, and I think the Democrats probably realize that and realize something needs to be done.
I want to get back to the matter of Ukraine while you're with us, Senator. Can you give us a sense of how much divide there is within the Republican conference in the Senate? We heard, for instance, from your colleague, J.D. Vance of Ohio, who seems to think this is another endless war, and we don't actually have an end game that senators can plan around. He issued a statement differentiating, to his point, Ukraine and Israel. What would be your answer?
Well, I think in terms of the way I see it, in terms of the Ukrainian funding for the military, I think there have to be guardrails. I think we have to make sure that it's not an endless humanitarian support, that it's military, that it's building up our own capabilities here at home, using American-made product that the Ukrainians are using. They are making progress. I see it more as a deter Putin exercise, because if he wins here, we know he goes to another NATO country. He won't to a NATO country, which then deepens our involvement. And right now, we don't have men and women on the ground, and we don't want that. Nobody wants that. So I think it has to be constraints, and I think you're going to see that come out of the House and probably out of the Senate as well.
Senator, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Sure.
Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia. We really appreciate that insight. Coming up, the U.S. Treasury announcing its plans to release new notes with a smaller issuance than expected. Kaylee Lyons has the details next. This is Balance of Power.
The longer-term rates that have moved up, they can't simply be a reflection of expected policy moves from us. It does not appear that an expectation of higher near-term policy rates is causing the increase in longer-term rates.
Fed Fed Chair Jerome Powell addressing higher bond yields in his press conference today, hours after the Treasury jolted the market after announcing its quarterly debt issuance plan. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is here with more to break it all down. Kaylee, make sense of it all for us.
Yeah, so Treasury refunding is essentially when the Treasury is paying off maturing debt by sales of new debt. And that total figure came in actually a little bit less than the market was expecting. They upped it by $9 billion this quarter to $112 billion rather than the $114 that was expected. And the auction breakdown is more centered at the front end. $48 billion of three-year notes, $40 billion of 10s, $24 billion of 30s. And the idea that this is centered, really putting more of the burden at the front end, probably speaks to some concern about the fact that we've seen longer end yields moving up significantly higher. So the pace of the supply increase there actually slowed down compared to the August refunding that we saw just a few months ago. As for the picture going forward, the Treasury says it is basically going to have to do just one more of these upped sizes next quarter. According to their statement, they said they anticipate one additional quarter of increases to coupon auction sizes. That's all that will likely be needed beyond the increases today. Now, the increases announced today, I would note, had a massive impact on the bond market, especially on the long end of the curve, because, again, there's not as much issuance there as maybe was feared. 20 basis point drop on the 10-year yield. That is the biggest single-day decline we've seen going back to the banking crisis in March of last year. A big drop on 30s as well, though part of this is due to the Federal Reserve's decision. And, of course, we just heard Chairman Powell there talking about the idea that yields have been at really elevated levels. And what he said actually contrasts a bit with what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen told our Washington bureau chief Peggy Collins when she was here last week. Just take a listen to that exchange.
What's your view on what is driving that surge in yields and how much of it is connected to investors' concerns about the U.S. deficit?
Well, I don't think much of it is connected to that. We're seeing yields go up in most advanced countries. Part of the increase in yields I think is simply a reflection of the strength of the economy, the notion that interest rates will be higher for longer.
The thing is, if interest rates are higher for longer, that actually has a major implication for the Treasury Department, because a higher cost of borrowing means you're making higher interest payments. And already this year, it's estimated the Treasury is going to have to pay out $1 trillion in those interest payments. And if rates stay elevated, according to an analysis that was cited by the Washington Post, in the next 3 years, debt payments could actually be the second biggest line item in U.S. federal expenditure, second only to Social Security. So the cost of maintaining that deficit and paying on the debt is only going to go higher, theoretically.
We're topping defense spending, which
Exactly.
is remarkable in itself.
In a decade, it'll be the top line item on the budget.
Isn't that something? So if interest rates stay higher for longer, as we keep hearing, is the Fed done?
Well, that is the question. Chairman Powell didn't really answer it today.
I have to put you on the spot like that, you know.
With 20 seconds to go.
Absolutely.
That's really unfair.
Saved by the bell. Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons coming up. Evelyn Farkas at the McCain Institute. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
We're continuing working to significantly step up the flow of critical humanitarian assistance into Gaza. The number of trucks entering Gaza continues to increase significantly, but we still have a long way to go. We're going to continue to affirm that Israel has the right to responsibility to defend its citizens from terror, and it needs to do so in a manner that is consistent with international and humanitarian law that prioritizes the protection of citizens.
President Joe Biden speaking earlier about the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. Let's go to Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Thank you so much for joining us. Once again today, we have horrific images coming out of Gaza. Another refugee camp was hit by Israeli strikes today. How can the administration do a better job of walking this line of supporting Israel, but at the same time making sure they are speaking out to protect innocent civilians?
Yeah, thank you, Anne-Marie and Joe, for having me on again. I mean, ultimately, the administration needs to put an end to this bombardment, which is causing the deaths as soon as possible. And the Israelis need to find a way to find those Hamas fighters, maybe not immediately, maybe over time, frankly, and of course punish them, but in the meantime, I don't think this is a lasting solution. And every day that goes by with the loss of more innocent lives is a bad day for the world. And so the administration needs to work with the international community and obviously with Israel to bring this massive bombardment, this part of the conflict to an end.
Well, the other side of this is humanitarian aid, of course. And I couldn't help but to hear recent remarks from Cindy McCain, who I know you're close to. She's now head of the World Food Program and calls the current situation catastrophic. She's been calling on leaders in Israel as well as Egypt and other neighbors to, as she put it, let us get our food in. She's pointing as well to the shortage of fuel, which makes it impossible to keep bakeries open, which makes it impossible to desalinate water. The case that she makes is compelling. How important is it for any lasting peace or for the administration to have a straight face in supporting Israel, to get this aid where it belongs?
Right, Joe. I mean, these are basic human rights, the right to food, the right to be fed by the international community. And Cindy McCain is absolutely right, Ambassador McCain, when she talks about the need for fuel to get the ovens going. You know, the reality is that Gaza is one of the poorest places in the world. Already people had been in a lot of food insecurity and a lot of poverty. And so this is only making things worse. And of course, Egypt is afraid of having a refugee flow. So the aid needs to be brought into those people where they are. The bombing needs to stop. And the international community, and now I'm talking not just about the United States, but the Gulf states, our European partners, and of course, Israel, we need to all step up and come up with at least a temporary solution that allows for the security of the people in Gaza. Humanitarian needs to be met, as well as the security of the people of Israel. And after that, I think that much more economic assistance and a political solution needs to be found to Gaza and the West Bank. We need to move back to the two-state solution.
As you talk about more international coordination, we had today the Jordanians recalling their ambassador to Israel and telling the Israelis that we don't want your ambassador here anymore. How much more difficult is that kind of coordination when you see this diplomacy fraying?
Well, I think that gets to the heart of the tactics that Israel is using right now. These bombings, even if there's a commander under a hospital or a large apartment building, it's very hard for anyone, frankly, to find that cost acceptable. There has to be another way to take out these Hamas fighters for them to either suffer, death or, other retribution, judicial retribution. The Israelis know how to do this, and you can, frankly, hunt them down over time. Special operations forces are probably in there, and they can continue their work. But the bombing, I think, has to stop, because it is very hard for us then to turn around to the Jordanians, who are key in any kind of diplomatic settlement, to say, help us, please.
Evelyn, I want to ask you about potential threats here at home. We heard from the FBI director who was testifying yesterday, Chris Wray, and his message on Capitol Hill, a bit of a warning to those of us here in the U.S. Let's listen to what he said and have you respond. Here he is.
The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level.
Evelyn, how worried should we be about this? How worried are you?
I am worried. I'm worried because, first of all, the level of hate has increased, and we saw the killing of a young Muslim boy in, I believe it was Michigan. We've seen all of the anti-Semitic acts and attacks, the rhetoric that's increased, the people pulling down posters of the missing hostages, the Jewish hostages who were taken into Gaza. The level and the tone of the hate has increased. So domestic terrorism is an increased possibility, unfortunately, or domestic hate targeting people. At the same time, we have the possibility that the international terrorists may take retribution against the United States, because, of course, we are backing our ally Israel, and Israel is causing a loss of Muslim lives. So there's a great deal of danger here for the United States, and this is why we really need to turn as fast as possible to a diplomatic solution. We need to offer the Palestinian people some kind of hope that they can have economic prosperity and their own state in the foreseeable future. And we need to make sure that the wealthy Gulf states, those states that have also neglected, frankly, the Palestinian people and this situation here, that they join us and Israel in finding a solution.
Well, on top of all of this, there's another conflict that's ongoing, even though it's almost been evaporated from the top headlines of newspapers. And that's, of course, Ukraine, as Congress debates whether or not they will continue to fund Ukraine. Do you think the administration is selling Ukraine well enough in terms of why the United States should continue to send aid to Kyiv?
Well, look, I don't know that you can blame it on the administration. For some reason, some people in the Democratic Party, a fringe, frankly, it's not the majority. The majority of the votes are for providing assistance to Ukraine. Why? Because if Vladimir Putin takes Ukraine, if he manages to win the war there, he will not stop at Ukraine. He will take over other countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. You will see him emboldened to help countries like Iran. I mean, they're already allied together in the fight in Ukraine. And then in Gaza, you've seen the Russian government basically meeting with the Hamas leader. So these countries, these very dangerous countries, are working together. If Russia prevails, if Ukraine is militarily defeated, Vladimir Putin will not stop. He will only strengthen Iran, and the world will become much more dangerous for the United States. And frankly, it will be a threat to NATO, which means that we may end up getting involved in a war, which is what we're trying to avoid by providing this assistance to Ukraine so they beat Russia in Ukraine.
Joining us in dangerous times, Evelyn Farkas. It's good to see you, Evelyn, with the McCain Center at Arizona State University. Thank you for your time, as always. Coming up, Congress struggling with coming to an end agreement over aid to Israel. We'll have all the details next with our political panel and what might come next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. The CBO scoring the House GOP Israel aid bill as a long-term increase to the deficit. That's not what we were told yesterday. Let's bring in our political panel. Kristen Hahn of Rock Solutions is here, along with Maura Gillespie of Blue Stack Strategies. Great to see you both. Maura, we're going to wonk out hard here. I know you're a creature of the House. You worked for a former speaker, and so you get this stuff. Speaker says we're going to take money from the IRS to offset this emergency request. A request that's typically not offset. But by taking that IRS money, it appears he would be increasing the deficit by nearly $30 billion. So who's being straight with the American people here?
And that's really what's frustrating, I think, as a Republican, right? We know what is in the bill. We know that the CBO is going to score it. And the messaging aspect of it is what they were going for, not the actual substance and what would happen with the bill, should it have ever gone anywhere past just being in bill form.
Okay.
The messaging part is that they're saying, okay, the IRS, we're giving them more of taxpayer dollars to take more taxpayer dollars. That to the American people is going to sound terrible, right? Great messaging opportunity for the Republican Party.
Easy to hate the IRS.
Right. However, in actuality, when the CBO came out and said how much it would cost, between 14 and 26 billion, and that is probably not being shared as an addendum to that first message. So it is misleading and disingenuous, and they're going to have to figure out a way to combat that, because if that's their messaging, where do they go from here?
Well, put the messaging aside. We just spoke to Senator Shelley Moore Capito, and she was saying, and she had lunch with the speaker, they all did, the Senate GOP, and she was saying we need to almost give him a win. She said even she would vote for Israel standalone. If he's able to take this win, doesn't everyone pretty much know that this, what the Democrats would call a poison pill, and this IRS, right, can we maybe say gimmick at this point, is not going to make it when it gets to Biden's desk, because it has no hope anywhere else?
How do you stand tall if you're being placated, right? I mean, that's what's happening here. And he needs and should have wanted to have a position of strength. When you're coming into these negotiations after 3 weeks of an embarrassment of turmoil in the party, that's not really the strongest start. So are they right in having questions about how much money was going into the IRS and how much money is being spent? Government? Yes, absolutely. Is this a time to have that fight and to have that argument when it's attached to an emergency funding bill? Yeah. No.
Okay, so that's the Republican on the panel. I'm afraid to ask Krista what you think about all of this. But I think the idea here is that Ukraine funding could be the casualty. Is that how you see it if Congress acts on Israel alone?
Certainly. And I think, the CBO score, the CBO is a nonpartisan organization that comes in and scores these things. Anybody who knows these types of bills and those types of pay-fors knew that this was going to happen if somebody asked for it. I think that the more dangerous thing we have to look at, and the new speaker would do well to remember in 2005, the emergency funding that Louisiana got, with all the hurricane damage, to attach, does emergency funding need to be paid for? Now, I've spent my own entire career working with moderate Dems and Blue Dogs who want things to be paid for, but there are some exceptions here. So, setting that precedent. But yes, Ukraine, I think you're definitely weakening Mitch McConnell's hand if a standalone bill, they do pass it through the Senate.
But one of the most staunchest hawks in the Republican Party, Lindsey Graham, had a lot to say after that lunch.
He likes this guy.
He likes this
he's the
guy.
man for the moment.
And he says, we also want some definition. Most of us don't want Putin to win. That's not a good thing. But we also want some definition. Is President Biden making the case for Ukraine that people can rally behind, why more U.S. taxpayer dollars should go there? Has he made that case, do you think, well enough to the American people?
I think that it's going to take a lot more work. I think the president's done what he can to use the bully pulpit to talk about our interests abroad and why Ukraine matters and why, what happened with Israel and Hamas matters and how it's all intertwined. I think Lindsey Graham sometimes, the Republicans don't want another loss. I mean, what are you going to do, vacate the chair again? But seriously, I mean, what can make it through the House? And I'm sure I'm not privy to the conversations in the Senate Republican conference, but sounds like there's a debate there about, they know that they need Ukraine funding. But do we go ahead and pass this Israel funding knowing it could be a big problem?
Well, Mark Wayne Mullen, the senator from Oklahoma, brought up the Budapest Memorandum. Not something you ever hear the White House talking about. Maybe they should start explaining some historical context.
Fair enough. You've got Mitch McConnell walking through Louisville with the ambassador to Ukraine, and it does make you wonder here. But motion to vacate is an important point to bring up here. It's technically not changed. What makes us think if they're not going to increase the threshold to fire the speaker, this doesn't happen again in a couple of weeks or months?
I think that may have gone into the calculations with what Mike Johnson is doing here by looking to appease the far right, by even proposing this in the first place. And again, we know this isn't going to go anywhere, but maybe this is what he's going to use to then negotiate, again, because they have very little capital to stand on given what happened with the speaker's vacancy for 3 weeks. So I think looking at it from that aspect, but I also think on the foreign policy, he's not going to be the person that's going to convince the Republican Party why it's important to support our allies. And quite frankly, neither is President Biden. The person who's doing the most for Ukraine right now is President Zelensky. He's the one who's reminding us why it's important for us to be firm and standing with our allies around the world. Netanyahu telling us why we need to stand firm with our allies. That should really be a question for us here at home. Why are we not hearing from the top?
Well, he did send Anthony Blinken and Lloyd Austin to the Hill to make the case yesterday.
I mean, Tony Blinken dressed up his son as Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday and brought him to the White House, which was an interesting take.
Is he making a point to the boss there?
I think so, on Halloween. But when you look at foreign policy and this big package the White House asked for, it included the southern border. Is that one place potentially that can bring not just House and Senate Republicans together, but also the House and the Senate?
Absolutely. Republicans are going to go into the campaign. And again, this bill, unfortunately, the CBO report is going to be plastered on every Democratic strategist's plan to how to target Republicans. But the American people largely believe that Republicans are best equipped to handle things on the economy and security. So if they were to go into these negotiations, they're going to need to explain to the American people why they voted against a border security chunk of funding right there. So it will play into how they look ahead to the campaign for 2024.
All right, our panel sticking with us. Coming up, Donald Trump, speaking of 2024, Junior, his son, testifying today in former President Trump's New York fraud trial. Our political panel will be back with us after the break as the kids take the stand. This is Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Donald Trump Jr. testified today in his father's New York civil fraud trial. For more, let's welcome back our political panel. Kristen Hahn of Rock Solutions and Maura Gillespie of Blue Stack Strategies. Thank you both for joining us. Okay, so it's not just Don Jr., though. Eric Trump, next week Ivanka Trump. What do we expect his children to say? This is a very tight-knit family, and for the most part, they have backed their father, even when they didn't agree behind the scenes. But now they're going to be under oath.
So far, what I've seen and what I kind of expected was to find other people to blame and say they took on a majority of our finances. We were barely involved, which is what Donald Trump Jr. said today, was that we trusted him entirely to handle it. And you can just see that that's going to be the route they go. I believe both their attorney and their financial advisor have already testified as well, saying we were not that involved. So it's just going to be a he said, she said, he said kind of game, I think.
Is there even a political side to this? He's got 4 indictments, for crying out loud, and maybe more serious legal challenges. At the same time, it's his brand they're talking about, and this seems to get under his skin more than any of the other 91 counts that he's facing.
Because it's always been about his brand. I mean, we saw when he was very first running for president, he had his Trump-branded stakes behind him, at the rally.
Yeah.
So I think it's always been about that. Do I think that his testimony is going to have any real impact? I mean, if everything that's happened so far has not had that much of an impact as far as him being the front runner in the in the Republican presidential race, I don't see how this will. But I agree. I think it's all he said. She said they're following their father's footsteps. That's what he's done traditionally with his staff and the people that work for him. So,
but at the same time, it does feel like for some in the Republican Party that they've been going after every aspect of the former president's life, his political life, his private life. Does this play into the hand of this is, quote unquote, a witch hunt? Does this potentially help the former president when you look at his political career potentially next year?
I mean, I think the people who are going to be ride or die with President Trump no matter what, it will definitely play into their feelings about the witch hunt. For those people who, you talk to who are just exhausted, that voted for him before but don't want again, or looking for other candidates, I think, I don't think it's going to have something
more. It's just more drama.
It's just more drama, more of the same, and you just keep piling on.
That's the potential for it to backfire, right? And the idea of indictment fatigue, which is something we've talked about a lot here. I mean, if he's going to be spending every other day in court for the next year and his base doesn't care, then these numbers don't move.
I think it'd be really hypocritical, though, for people to say, which I guess shouldn't be surprising, but for people to say, it's overreaching and it's all for show to have the Trump kids there on the stand, and then also want to have Hunter Biden held accountable for the dealings he made. So when you're looking at it, again, Eric and Donald Trump Jr. all had EVP roles at the company. They had very high titles, at least, and so were intricately involved. So I think it's hard to sit there and say, sure, it's okay to do it to Hunter, but it's not okay to do it to Trump and vice versa. So, I mean, to me, I just think that it has been too intertwined, and we really need to move beyond both Trump and
Well, moving on, we weren't really going to discuss this, but he was just speaking on the House floor a little bit ago. And it's George Santos. Let me bring you a quote of what he said. The loss of presumption of innocence established a dangerous precedent. Santos said, I'm fighting to clear my name in front of the entire world. It hasn't been easy. Do you expect an expulsion of this man?
I mean, it's pretty damning what's up against him. House Ethics Committee, it's, when they're looking at a case like this, they're outside. It's not his fellow members that are looking at him. They bring in other former members to come in and assess these cases. So I do think that they're looking at this from, again, an outside looking in and all the facts that's in front of them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't look good for George Santos.
Well, it's interesting because we've got a potential expulsion vote that you're talking about. But the Ethics Committee is asking lawmakers to slow the roll here, Krista. They said we kicked out 37 subpoenas and reviewed more than 170,000 documents. Give us a minute. We're on to something. How does this come to a close then?
I'm not sure exactly how it comes to a close, but if I'm a Republican, I want George Santos gone. I mean, he's a huge political liability headed into next year.
And would you like your name to be on it?
I mean, no.
Or is it better for the Ethics Committee?
I think it's hard to say when you're looking at, there are some members of the Republican Party in the House that continue to defend him. So what are the motivations there? I think, if I'm a rank-and-file member of the House, particularly, like I said, one of those freshmen who are in these tough seats in New York or elsewhere across the country, I want him gone. Yeah. The focus there isn't helpful for anybody, and it's not helpful for the Congress, writ large.
Where our colleagues on the Hill says no one showed up to defend him on the House floor. So we get a sense of where things are. But at the same time, you're saying if you're a Republican, you want him out. But he still is a vote. And this majority is getting slimmer by the day. Don't they need his vote?
they need to work across the aisle. That's what they really need to be doing. But yes, they should want it. But to this point here, they should want to grow their majority. Yeah. And the way to grow their majority is to appeal to the American people and win elections. And we're not going to win elections if we put up George Santos candidates. Mm-hmm. So this should be a lesson to actually run with integrity.
See, every vote counts, but is there a difference between 4 and 5? I
Well,
don't know.
have you looked at the data behind New York? A lot of New Yorkers don't go out to vote.
Well, they might this time, right?
Sure.
Kristen Hodmore, Gillespie, great conversation, and thank you. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks so much for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.